What happens when boredom meets danger? This is the story of a soldier, a mysterious woman, and a secret that could change lives forever. The room was still, save for the soft tick of the clock on Major John Carter's desk. The weight of the evening settled on his shoulders as he leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the letter in front of him. The paper was aged, yellowed at the edges as if it had traveled through time itself to reach him. But it was the strange cryptic symbol scrawled across the page that sent a chill down his spine. It wasn't just the bizarre markings. This wasn't the first cryptic message he'd received. No, it was the words beneath them. Your past hides a treasure and a curse. Find it before they do. His fingers tightened around the edges of the letter, as if the words themselves had a hold on him. He had seen more than his fair share of danger in his career: war zones, covert operations, and enemies that never quite stayed dead. But this was something different, something personal. The message was a ghost from his past, a past he had long buried under layers of military protocols and unspeakable secrets. But now, it seemed, those secrets were coming back to haunt him. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see a ghostly figure standing in the doorway. But the room remained empty. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence: a soft, almost imperceptible tap against the window. Carter's heart skipped a beat. He slowly turned his gaze toward the window. His breath hitched. There, barely visible through the thick curtains, was the unmistakable shadow of someone standing just outside. A rush of adrenaline shot through him. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor with an audible screech as the figure outside shifted and disappeared from view. His mind raced. Was it a mistake, or had someone been watching him? He moved toward the window cautiously, his military instincts kicking in. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the realization that something had shifted. The world he'd known had just been upended by a single piece of paper. The message on the letter echoed in his mind. Find it before they do. He pressed his palms to the cool glass, peering out into the growing darkness. Nothing. But Carter knew this was just the beginning. Whoever they were already hunting him, and time was running out.
"Stay where you are," the man barked, his voice low and guttural. Freda's face paled, but she didn't flinch. Carter's mind raced. He recognized the type: mercenaries, probably hired by someone with a lot to lose. They were here for the treasure. And they weren't leaving without it. "Get up," the man ordered, waving the gun toward the exit. But Carter wasn't about to follow orders. He glanced at Freda, seeing the fear in her eyes and a flash of something else: determination. She wasn't going to go down without a fight. Neither was he. With a sudden, fluid motion, Carter grabbed the coffee pot from the table and hurled it toward the man closest to him. The boiling liquid splashed across his face, momentarily blinding him. The man screamed in pain, stumbling backward. "Go!" Carter yelled, pushing Freda toward the back door. But as they moved, another of the masked men lunged forward, knocking Freda off balance. Carter reacted instantly, swinging a fist into the man's jaw, sending him crashing to the floor. The third man, undeterred, opened fire. The bullet whizzed past Carter's shoulder, narrowly missing. Freda gasped, her face a mask of terror, but Carter didn't stop. He grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the door with all his strength. "Run!" he shouted. They dashed out into the alley, their footsteps echoing in the narrow, dimly lit passage. The sounds of pursuit grew louder behind them, but they couldn't afford to look back. The world was closing in, and they had no choice but to run. As they rounded a corner, Carter spotted an old delivery van parked in the shadows. Without hesitation, he yanked open the door, shoving Freda inside before climbing in himself. The engine roared to life, and they sped away, the pursuit momentarily lost in the rain-soaked streets. Freda was breathless, her eyes wide with shock. What the hell was that? Who were they? Carter gritted his teeth, slamming the van into gear. "Doesn't matter. They're part of the same group who wants what we're looking for, and they'll keep coming until we're dead." Freda looked out the back window, her voice shaky. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" Carter didn't answer. Instead, he drove faster, the city lights blurring into streaks. There was no turning back now. They had just crossed into a game where the stakes were life and death. As the van sped into the night, a chill settled in Carter's gut. They had barely escaped with their lives, but the real danger was just beginning. And whatever it was that Freda's father had discovered, it was more than just treasure. It was a curse that would follow them to the ends of the earth, unless they could uncover its secrets first.
The hidden past cliffhanger. The revelation. The dimly lit apartment smelled of dust and old paper, the weight of forgotten years thick in the air. Carter moved quietly through the room, his gaze scanning the various papers and personal effects that had once belonged to Freda's father. He didn't want to be Heronot with the memories it stirred up, and not with the mounting pressure to find answers, but Freda had insisted. "This is it," Freda said quietly from the corner of the room, her voice barely above a whisper. She was standing by a wooden desk, a desk cluttered with old books and a scattering of maps. The kind of maps that Carter had seen before, maps that only the most desperate of men would be hunting for. Maps that could lead to something far more valuable than money, a truth long buried. Carter approached her, his heart hammering in his chest. They had been piecing together fragments of clues for days now, each one pulling them deeper into a web of lies. But this could be the break they needed. She gently unfurled a weathered piece of parchment, her fingers tracing the faded ink. It was a map, but not just any map. This one had markings that made Carter's breath catch in his throat. They were too familiar. The coordinates, the place on the map. It was a location tied directly to his past, a place he had hoped never to revisit. His throat tightened. "Where did you find this?" Freda didn't answer immediately. She seemed lost in the map's details, her fingers lingering on the spot where the ink had worn thin. Finally, she looked up at him, eyes searching his face as if looking for answers he wasn't willing to give. "My father. He knew about this place, this location. He was obsessed with it, Carter. But he never told me why. I think he thought it would kill him if he did." Carter's mind raced, but he couldn't bring himself to speak. The memories of that place, the mission in Africa, came rushing back in a flood of guilt and fear. What had he done? And how was Freda's father involved? Then, as if the universe had decided to push him to confront his demons head-on, Freda pulled out another item from the Pyne old photograph. The edges were frayed, the image faded by time, but it was unmistakable. Freda held it up, her eyes narrowing with disbelief. In the photo, a much younger version of Carter stood alongside Freda's father. They were in uniform, standing side by side, smiling at something off camera. But there was something wrong about the image. Freda's father, despite the smile on his face, seemed uneasy, his eyes darting to the side, as if aware that something was closing in on him. Freda's voice broke through the silence. "Why didn't you tell me you knew my father?" Carter stiffened, a cold sweat breaking out along his spine. He'd known Freda's father. Of course he had, but he had never mentioned it. Why would he? It was a part of his life. He had read a chapter he'd closed the moment he left Africa, a chapter full of shadows and unanswered questions. "I didn't think it mattered," Carter said quietly, his voice strained.
Freda's eyes widened, the words burning with accusation. "You knew him. You were there. And you never told me. Why, Carter? What else are you hiding?" Carter swallowed hard, his mind racing for an explanation that wouldn't sound like an excuse. He wanted to tell her the truth, but could he? Could he open that door? The door to the guilt that gnawed at him every night, the guilt over what had happened during that mission, and the possibility that Freda's father had been one of the casualties of a decision Carter had made years ago. He looked at her, the weight of her question hanging in the air like a thick fog. "It's complicated," he muttered, his eyes dropping to the floor. "Things didn't go as planned, Freda. A lot of good men. They didn't come back. And your father, he was one of them, I thought." "What did you think?" Freda interrupted, her voice rising. "That I wouldn't want to know. That I wouldn't deserve to understand what happened to him." Carter's jaw tightened, and for a moment he couldn't speak. He had known this moment was coming, but he hadn't prepared for how much it would hurt to face the truth. He had promised to protect her, to keep her out of this. But now, as Freda stood before him, eyes blazing with a mixture of hurt and anger, he realized how much he had underestimated her. She shook her head, her voice trembling with emotion. "You've been lying to me, haven't you? Keeping things from me, and I don't know if I can trust you anymore." A silence fell between them, thick with tension. Carter could feel the fragile thread of trust they had built over the last few days beginning to snap, and with it, his hopes for solving this mystery with her. She wasn't just a partner in this hunt. She was a person he had come to care about, and now that bond was in jeopardy. He wanted to reach out to her, to explain everything, but the words wouldn't come. His past was too heavy, too dark to drag into the light. Freda took a step back, shaking her head, her eyes still locked on him. "I need answers, Carter. I don't know if I can keep going with you if you are hiding the truth. All of it. You owe me that much." The room seemed to close in around them, the weight of their unresolved tension suffocating the air. Carter felt the guilt crush him from the inside out. He had always known this moment would come. He had known that the truth would come out eventually. But he wasn't prepared for how it would feel to see Freda look at him with distrust in her eyes. As Freda turned and walked toward the door, Carter's chest tightened, his fingers brushing the edge of the map they had uncovered together. The location. The place that had been the catalyst for everything that had gone wrong. He wasn't sure if he could fix this, if Freda would ever forgive him, but one thing was certain. The past was coming back for both of them, and it wouldn't stop until the secrets were fully uncovered. Cliffhanger. The trust between Carter and Freda is broken, leaving them on the precipice of an emotional and moral chasm. Carter stands at the crossroads of his past and present, unable to escape the guilt that haunts him. And Freda, now uncertain of his motive, steps out of the room, leaving him with the haunting question: can they ever rebuild what was lost? Twists and tension, the double cross. Carter and Freda had placed their trust in Daniel Harper, an old friend of Carter's from his military days. A brilliant cartographer and seemingly reliable ally, Daniel was the one who deciphered the map's symbols and promised to guide them to the treasure. But as the trio made camp at an abandoned railway station near the treasure's suspected location, Daniel seemed distracted, constantly glancing over his shoulder and fidgeting with his pack. That night, as the fire crackled softly and Freda dozed off, Carter noticed Daniel was gone. The sound of rustling footsteps outside confirmed his fears. Grabbing his revolver, Carter followed the faint glow of a lantern into the dense forest. He caught a glimpse of Daniel hunched over the map, muttering to himself. "Daniel," Carter called out, gun drawn. "What the hell are you doing?" Daniel froze, clutching the map to his chest. "Two can't do this, Carter," he stammered. His eyes darted around nervously. "They're watching us. They've been watching me. If I don't do what they say, I am dead." "What are you talking about?" Carter demanded, his voice a low growl. "Who's watching you?" Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he threw a small, crumpled piece of paper at Carter's feet and bolted into the darkness. Carter's instincts screamed to chase him, but the chilling weight of Daniel's words rooted him to the spot. Back at camp, Carter unfolded the note under the dim lantern light. Written in shaky, hurried handwriting were the words: "I had no choice. They're watching me. Don't trust anyone." Freda, now awake and alarmed, joined Carter. Her eyes scanned the note before flickering to him. "What does he mean by this? Who are they?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Carter replied, though his tone lacked conviction. He folded the note and shoved it into his pocket. His mind was already racing, retracing every step of their journey, every person they had spoken to, and every shadow that had crossed their path. But the past wasn't done haunting him. Later, as they sifted through Daniel's belongings in search of clues, Freda pulled out an old photograph from a weathered notebook. Her face turned pale as she studied it. The photograph showed her father standing next to a group of men in uniform. Among them was a much younger Carter, his arm slung casually over her father's shoulder. "Why didn't you tell me you knew my father?" Freda's voice was sharp, almost accusing. Carter hesitated, guilt pooling in his chest like lead. "It was a long time ago," he admitted. "He was part of the same mission in Africa, but I didn't know him well." "That's not what this picture says," Freda snapped, holding it up. "You look like friends. Did your mission have something to do with his disappearance?" "I don't know," Carter said firmly, though even he wasn't sure if it was the truth. Memories of that fateful mission, shrouded in secrecy and regret, surged to the surface. He remembered the orders to secure the area, the chaotic firefight, and the local informant who had vanished under mysterious circumstances. Was it Freda's father? The tension between them crackled like static in the air. Freda's trust in Carter began to erode, and Carter's own doubts gnawed at him. As the night stretched on, the forest seemed to close in around them, the distant sound of rustling leaves and snapping twigs serving as a constant reminder they weren't alone. The stakes had never been higher, and now the question wasn't just about who they could trust, but whether they could even trust each other. Danger rises, trapped in the flooded vault. The abandoned building loomed over Carter and Freda like a sentinel of secrets, its crumbling walls whispering of long-forgotten betrayals. The air was damp and thick with decay as they pushed through the rotted wooden door. Inside, the faint scent of mildew mingled with the metallic tang of something older, something hidden. "It has to be here," Carter murmured, holding up the battered map Daniel had decoded before his betrayal. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating broken furniture, collapsed beams, and shattered glass. Freda followed close behind, her every step crunching against debris. "This place feels like a tomb," she said under her breath. "That's because it is," Carter replied grimly. "These places were built to protect, but they can just as easily trap." They found the vault hidden beneath a trapdoor in the floor. Rusted hinges groaned as Carter heaved it open, revealing a narrow stone staircase spiraling into the earth. The air grew colder and more oppressive with each step they descended, their breath visible in the faint glow of their flashlights. At the bottom, they found it. A massive iron vault door stood before them, its surface etched with symbols matching those on the map. Freda ran her fingers over the carvings, her pulse quickening. "This is it, isn't it?" Carter nodded, his jaw set. "Let's hope it was worth all this trouble." The door creaked open after a painstaking process of aligning the symbols, a combination of logic, luck, and sheer determination. Inside was a chamber that seemed untouched by time. Stacks of gold coins glinted in the light. Ancient artifacts were arranged on pedestals, and at the center sat a chest adorned with intricate carvings. Freda gasped, "It's beautiful." But Carter's instincts screamed danger. He scanned the room, noting faint grooves in the floor, a suspiciously smooth ceiling, and the faint scent of something chemical. "Don't touch anything yet," he warned. Too late. Freda had already stepped inside. The moment her foot crossed the threshold, a low rumble echoed through the chamber. "What was that?" Freda asked, panic creeping into her voice. Carter cursed under his breath. "A trigger." The door slammed shut behind them with a deafening clang, and a hiss filled the air. Water began gushing from hidden spouts in the walls, cascading over the floor and pooling around their feet. "Carter!" Freda cried, her voice rising with fear. "I see it," Carter shouted, already searching the room for a way out. The water was rising fast, sloshing around their ankles, then their knees. "Is there a release mechanism, a hidden lever?" Freda asked, frantically scanning the walls. Carter was already at the chest, prying it open with his knife. Inside, among the treasure, was a lever hidden beneath false panels. "This has to be it," he muttered, pulling the lever. Instead of stopping the water, it doubled the flow. "Carter, we're going to drown here." Freda's voice broke as the water reached her chest, icy and relentless. "Not if I can help it." Carter snapped, his mind racing. He spotted an air vent high on the wall, but it was too small for them to climb through. The ceiling above showed faint cracks, weak points. "Help me," he yelled, grabbing a metal pole from the treasure pile and aiming it at the ceiling. Freda, trembling but determined, joined him. Together they rammed the pole upward again and again, water surging higher with every strike. Finally, the ceiling gave way, a cascade of rubble falling into the chamber. Light streamed in from above, and Carter boosted Freda up through the narrow opening before hauling himself out, gasping for air. They collapsed on the ground outside, soaked and shivering, as the sound of water gushing below echoed ominously. Freda turned to Carter, her face pale but her eyes blazing. "We almost died down there." Carter stared back, his face hard. "But we didn't, and now we know just how far they'll go to keep this secret buried." As they sat in the cold light of dawn, the vault's treasure felt less like a prize and more like a curse. And somewhere in the shadows, Carter knew, their enemies were watching. The climactic escape, the final betrayal. The night was alive with danger. Carter and Freda crouched behind a crumbling stone wall, their breath visible in the cold moonlit air. The distant roar of the syndicate's engines reverberated through the valley, growing louder by the second. "They're closing in," Freda whispered, clutching the treasure map to her chest. "I know," Carter replied, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling around them. He glanced at his watch, then at the narrow bridge spanning the gorge ahead. It was their only way out. "What's the plan?" Freda asked, her tone tinged with both desperation and trust. Carter met her eyes, his gaze firm. "We're going to give them exactly what they want us." Before she could question him further, Carter grabbed a satchel filled with rocks and debris, identical to the one containing the real treasure, and sprinted toward the bridge. Freda followed reluctantly, her instincts screaming that something was amiss. As they reached the bridge, the sound of the engines morphed into headlights piercing the darkness. Men armed with rifles poured out of the vehicles, their shouts echoing off the canyon walls. "There they are. Don't let them escape." Carter and Freda darted across the bridge, but halfway across, Carter stopped abruptly. He handed Freda the map. "Keep running," he ordered. "What? No, I am not leaving you," she protested. "Just trust me," he said, his voice soft but unyielding. Then, without another word, he yanked a detonator from his pocket and pressed the trigger. The explosion was deafening, ripping through the night as the bridge crumbled into the gorge below. Freda screamed as she stumbled forward, the blast throwing her to the ground. When she turned back, the bridge was gone along with Carter. For a moment the syndicate stood in stunned silence, their quarry seemingly dead. Then, one by one, they began to retreat, muttering curses about a treasure lost forever. Freda sat there, trembling, staring into the void where Carter had been. But before despair could take hold, a hand clamped over her mouth from behind. "Shh," Carter's voice whispered in her ear. "It's me." She spun around, her relief quickly replaced by anger. "You faked your death." "Had to," he said with a smirk, pulling her to her feet. "It's the only way to get them off our trail." Freda punched his arm. "You idiot. You scared me half to death." But her relief was short-lived. As they made their way to a nearby hideout, a small cabin tucked into the forest, something nagged at Freda. Carter was too calm, too focused. And the satchel he carried didn't look like it was filled with rocks anymore. Once inside, Freda rounded on him. "What's in the bag, Carter?" He froze, his eyes betraying the slightest hint of guilt. "Nothing you need to worry about." Her voice rose, cutting through the tension. "Show me." Carter sighed, setting the satchel on the table and opening it. Inside, the glint of gold and the shimmer of jewels confirmed her worst fears. "You lied to me," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of betrayal and fury. "You had the treasure all along." "I had to," Carter replied, his tone defensive but not unkind. "If they thought we had it, they'd never stop chasing us. This was the only way to keep you safe." Freda shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "Was this ever about the truth? About my father? Or was it always just about the treasure?" Carter stepped closer, but she backed away, her trust shattered. "Freda, listen to me. This treasure is more than gold. It's proof evidence of the syndicate's crimes. Your father died trying to uncover this. I am trying to finish what he started." But Freda wasn't convinced. She grabbed her coat and stormed toward the door. "You keep your treasure, Carter. I am done being a pawn in your game." As she disappeared into the night, Carter stood alone, the weight of his choices pressing heavily on his shoulders. He glanced at the treasure, then at the map she'd left behind. He whispered to himself, "It's not over yet." Outside, unseen by either of them, the faint glow of a cigarette lit up in the darkness. A shadowy figure watched from the tree line, a sinister smile spreading across his face. The game was far from over, and the stakes were about to get much higher. Resolution: Parker Pyne's letter. The morning was gray and cold, the kind that seeped into your bones and made every breath feel heavier. Carter stood at the train station, his coat buttoned tightly against the chill. He watched as Freda climbed into the carriage, her expression unreadable. Neither of them spoke the words they wanted to, and the silence between them felt like a chasm that no bridge could span. As the train's whistle blew and it began to pull away, Carter took a step forward, as if to call her back, but stopped himself. Instead, he reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the worn edges of the treasure map she'd left behind. The treasure wasn't worth it if it meant losing her, but now it was too late. Freda, seated by the window, watched the station recede into the distance. Her hand rested on her lap, trembling slightly. She hated the way they'd parted so much left unsaid. But what hurt more was the feeling that perhaps she'd never really known him at all. Hours later, as the train sped through the countryside, Freda opened her handbag to retrieve her journal. Tucked between the pages, she found an envelope that hadn't been there before. Her name was written in elegant cursive on the front. At the same time, in his small London apartment, Carter placed his coat on the back of a chair and froze. An envelope sat on the desk, addressed to him in the same neat handwriting. Both opened their envelopes simultaneously, miles apart, but connected by the same thread of intrigue. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the message short but loaded with meaning. "Your happiness was the treasure all along. Until we meet again, Parker Pyne." Carter's brow furrowed as he read the words. His mind raced. Parker Pyne. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but he couldn't place it. Was this some kind of joke? Or another layer to the mystery he thought he'd unraveled? Freda, too, stared at the note in disbelief. "Parker Pyne," she murmured aloud. Then it hit her. She'd read about him as self-proclaimed expert in happiness and solving life's dilemmas. But what did he have to do with her and Carter's ordeal? As if on cue, both Freda and Carter noticed something else in their envelope piece of photograph. Freda showed her father standing next to Carter's commanding officer, both men smiling and holding a small, ornate chest, the treasure she and Carter had risked everything for. Carter's photograph, however, was far more chilling. It showed a group of men from his mission in Africa, all marked with red crosses over their face except for him. Scrawled across the bottom were the words, "This isn't over." Freda clutched the photo tightly, her pulse quickening. Was this a clue, a warning, or something more sinister? Carter, meanwhile, leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning. Parker Pyne, was he an ally, or another player in this dangerous game? And who was behind the threats that refused to let him go? Both felt a strange mix of unease and curiosity. The treasure they'd uncovered seemed insignificant compared to the storm brewing just beyond their reach. As the scene faded to black, the sound of a typewriter filled the air, the rhythmic clacking echoing like a heartbeat. In a dimly lit office, a man sat behind a desk, his face obscured by shadows. He folded his hands over a stack of letters identical to the ones Carter and Freda had received. A sly smile spread across his face as he murmured to himself, "Oh, my dear players, the game has only just begun." The screen cut to black, leaving the audience breathless with anticipation for what might come next. The last twist, the real threat. Carter sat at his kitchen table, the soft hum of the city outside the only sound breaking the silence. The events of the past weeks had finally begun to feel distant, almost like a strange dream. The treasure, Freda, the betrayals, it all seemed like a story he'd heard rather than lived. For the first time in days, his body relaxed. He reached for his coffee when a knock at the door startled him. Frowning, Carter stood and approached cautiously. Through the peephole, he saw no one. Opening the door, he found only a brown envelope on the mat, addressed to him in blocky handwriting. Curiosity tinged with unease, Carter took it to the table and opened it. A single photograph slid out. His breath caught in his throat. The photograph was old, grainy, and unmistakable. It showed a group of men his unit from the Africa mission. They stood shoulder to shoulder, dusty uniforms bearing the scars of the desert. But someone had altered the photo. Each face, save his own, was crossed out with thick, red ink. The red lines felt violent, like slashes of rage, and a chill ran down Carter's spine. Beneath the photo, scrawled in the same red ink, were 3 words: "You're next." Carter's hand trembled as he dropped the photo onto the table. His eyes darted to the window, scanning the street outside. Was someone watching him right now? He thought about the photograph's message, the men who had once been his comrades, and the dangerous secrets that had long been buried in the sands of Africa. His heart raced as memories came flooding back. He saw their faces, heard their laughter, felt the bond they had shared. But he also remembered the mission, how it had gone wrong, how decisions were made that couldn't be undone. Was this a warning, revenge, or something even darker? Just then, his phone buzzed. A new message popped up from an unknown number. It wasn't about the treasure. It's about the truth. Look closer. The words sent a fresh wave of unease coursing through him. Carter stared at the photo again. He grabbed a magnifying glass and scanned every inch of it. That's when he saw it, something barely noticeable in the background. A shadowy figure, blurred but present, standing just behind the group. It hadn't been there in the original photograph. Of that he was certain. A single thought chilled him to the bone. Was it the same figure Freda had spotted that night at the vault? Carter leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. And now, it seemed, the stakes were higher than ever. He stared at the photo once more, his mind racing with questions. But one burned brighter than the rest. Who's coming for me, and why? As the screen fades to black, the photograph remains in focus, the red ink glaring against the aged paper. A faint whisper echoes, barely audible. It's always been about the truth. For the audience, what do you think Carter's past holds? Is it revenge, betrayal, or a secret darker than we've yet imagined? Let us know your theories, because the next chapter might just hinge on what you uncover.